Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Village ZM podcast. During the month of October, we're talking history, Zambian history, solely focused on our people and what led to this common identity we share. Being Zambian means much more than just citizenship, so join us on this journey of self-discovery through in-depth analysis on anthropology and historical context.
One who Zambia, one who nation, one who Zambia, one who nation, one who Zambia, one who nation.
I don't know, guys. We're gonna be talking for a while. You should get some water.
I got water on my side.
Also good water.
Oh, I don't. Let me get some water.
No, Bangers, you're not showing pressure, exit.
I'm trying to press on mud. Bro, this is very new to me.
Bad exit.
Anyway, you have to scare yourself sometimes, eh?
And
Get out of your comfort zone.
Indeed. I've got newfound respect for ones that do this stuff, man.
Right?
Like, just airing your opinions or like your thoughts for other people to listen to, bruh.
Aye.
It seems so like invasive, bruh.
It does, like enter my mind.
Oh my God. Are you guys ready?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Can someone please count down for me?
Yeah, Bangers, you can go, bruh.
All right. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's good, everybody? Welcome to this week's episode of the Village ZM and the third week of Zambia History Month. We have really enjoyed having these conversations and getting a lot of feedback. We are very grateful for all the feedback. We're also grateful for all the support we've gotten from our collaborators and from Rovert Radio, who've also been airing our episodes on their platform. So very grateful for that. So today, we are moving away from the anthropology segment that we've been doing the last 2 weeks. And in this week of Zambia History Month, we are looking at political history. And the aim with this is more or less to just give everyone a crash course on political history, because I feel like from the way we've designed this episode, by the end of this discussion on political history, you should be able to catch up with where we are at as a country now, but also understand what has happened in the past that has contributed to the way we do politics right now. I have 2 guests with me here. I have Kabanga and I have Vincent. How are you guys doing?
I'm doing all right. Thanks.
And how are you doing, Vincent?
Oh, no, all right.
That's good. I'm excited to have this conversation with you guys.
Yeah, I'm so excited as well.
Before we get started, would you guys like to introduce yourselves? Kabanga, you can go first.
Thanks, Malimba, for having me here. Thank you, the Village ZM. I am Kabanga. People say my name differently. I am studying agribusiness management at Stellenbosch University. Slated to finish my master's this year, actually. I have keen interest in agricultural transformation and rural development. And I'm really just excited to be a part of this conversation. I take quite a bit of interest in the history of Zambia and how it's going to inform our future.
Fantastic. Vincent, you can go next. Tell us about yourself.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me, Malimba, in the Village ZM. My name is Vincent. I like to say my surname, Punabantu, doing my master's in mechanical engineering at the University of Cape Town, primarily focusing in computational biomechanics. So basically, I use computers and math to simulate stuff that goes on in the body. And yes, many of you may be wondering, what is the guy that, crunches numbers? What is he doing? Talking about politics. You can think of this as a new refresher course on, civics 2.0. And yeah, just this is part of what I'm interested in, because I want to see Zambia develop, grow, but we also need to be aware of the context of the times that we find ourselves in. So really happy to be here.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be pretty interesting to delve into this conversation, because I remember when we used to do like history back in secondary school, like writing those essays was very forced, because it was more about memorizing rather than actually understanding what happened.
100%.
And I guess if we had a little more context as to what was going on, a little more information, or if we actually took the time to dig deeper and find this information. I mean, the internet has transformed so much, and everything is now on the internet. As much information as we could possibly access from each resource available, we should more or less take advantage of that. And, I guess this is a starting point for that. So, let's dive right in. I'm going to start by opening a discussion on what happened before we got independence, the colonial era. The best place to start is in 1884, when the Litunga is overthrown and eventually returns to power in 1885. And when this happens, the biggest worry for the Litunga is the Ndebele, because the Litunga wants to be protected from the Ndebele whenever they attack. He asked Francois Coillard. Oh my God, I know in the episode before this one, so he pronounced it. I don't remember how he pronounced it, but like for me, I'm gonna say Francois Coillard. I might be wrong. I don't know. Can you guys correct me?
Yeah, bro.
I'm not French, eh? I don't know.
Okay, yeah.
Quick question for those who would wonder, like, who is the Litunga?
The Litunga is the Lozi king. And this hasn't changed even right now. The Litunga is the Lozi king. So the Lozi king asks Francois from the Paris Evangelical Society to help them create a petition to become a British protectorate. Now, during this time, we had the emergence of the British South Africa Company, who had been eyeing this era strategically, because John Cecil Rhodes, the founder of British South Africa Company, saw this area as a gateway to the copper deposits in Katanga. So British South African Company then make an offer to the British government that they will pay costs for the British protectorate. These are administrative costs and everything that needs to happen for this to be finalized. British South African Company then signed a concession with Barotseland in the year 1890. And the simple terms of this agreement were minerals in exchange for protection from Ndebele attacks. So at this time, BSAC lied that they represented the British government, when in actual sense they didn't. The British government happened not to sanction British South African Company for this, so they kind of got away with this. Barotseland was then considered to be part of the British sphere of influence under the Anglo-Portuguese Treaty of 1891. This more or less signified a series of border adjustments that more or less formed the Northern Rhodesia border. So you had the Northeastern Rhodesia's northern border that was agreed in the Anglo-German Convention, the border between Northwestern Rhodesia and Southwest Africa, which is now called Namibia. And then you had more or less a battle between the Congo Free State administration and British South Africa Company, because, like I said, British South African Company saw Northwestern Rhodesia as a gateway to Katanga. Because of this, they saw the Katanga region as more or less free land. But then King Leopold of Belgium also wanted Katanga, and he claimed the territory after signing a treaty in 1894. So that more or less settled the issue. And this is how we ended up with Northeastern and Northwestern Rhodesia, which were considered separate until the year 1911. So British South African Company ran the affairs of this Northern Rhodesia nation, as you would call it. And the person who they had in charge of this Northern Rhodesia administration was, I think they called it an administrator, but the administrator had similar roles to what you would call a governor. But then these powers that were given to the administrator were limited, and there was this supreme executive power that was given to the High Commissioner of South Africa that allowed this High Commissioner to be the only one who's able to have certain powers on certain decisions that are to be made within Northern Rhodesia. There was absolutely no separation of power, and instead there was more or less an advisory committee. There was no legislative power or anything. There was just a lot of power that was given to this administrator, and even more power given to the High Commissioner. And the law that governed the land of Northern Rhodesia was common law. And common law is the law that Britain used. In summary, that's what it is. So at this time, Northern Rhodesia had absolutely no representation of local Africans living within this area. And they were just limited to a few nominated members. Their views were more or less silenced, and anyone who wanted to protest at the time was suppressed. And I think this is what resulted in the beginning of hostility of these Rhodesians, because I think in the beginning, they were very comfortable because as far as they were concerned, they were being protected. And that's why you have this British protectorate term that they more or less felt like they understood. But then when this started to feel like their voice was being undermined and they were being silenced, they started to have a problem with everything that was going on. In 1923, we see something interesting happen in the neighboring Southern Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. What happens is that the British South African Company are no longer in charge of Southern Rhodesia, and the British Crown take over Southern Rhodesia. The next year, the same thing happens in Northern Rhodesia. And in 1924, they also become under the British Crown rather than the British South Africa Company. And a governor is appointed in Herbert Stanley, and Livingstone is made the capital city until about 1935. A legislative council is introduced at this time. And so there's more or less a bit more of a separation of powers. But Black people still had no right to vote. So African people were still not given the power to make key decisions and have their voices heard. And the colonial office was the main administrative office, but British South African Company, now after not being in charge, took the role of just owning the mines. After all, that's the only reason they came to Africa in the first place. That's all they wanted from the beginning. And the means of getting there was offering protection. But now they didn't really have to run the affairs of the country. In the late 1930s, we saw some theory being developed by someone who's called Lord Lugar, who believed that the aim of this ruling of these African countries should be to benefit the indigenous persons in these countries. And so we see a shift from direct rule, which was established in the 1890s, to indirect rule. One thing that's very interesting is that for some reason, this direct rule did not apply to Barotseland. So Barotseland were never under direct rule. They were always under indirect rule. This was how things worked within the 1930s. But then another thing that happened in the 1930s was that there was suddenly this rise of independent African churches, as well as the Watchtower movement, Wachitawala. And you had a lot more people getting educated from both the missions locally and abroad. This obviously meant the more people that are getting educated, the more communities that are gathering, the more awareness that is being spread. And this led to a series of protests that began in the mines, specifically in Mufulira, Nkana, and Ron Antelope. And these protests were due to unhappiness by the mine workers because they were being paid very low wages and they were constantly being charged more and more of what the British government were calling hut tax. And from the beginning, the locals did not agree with this hut tax being implemented. And the moment these areas started to experience these protests, the British South Africa Company, who were in charge of these mining areas where the protests were occurring, started to interrupt these protests with their police. In the process, some Black people were dead, which is very sad. And I think this is something that can be actually related to what happened during the protests in Johannesburg during apartheid, because then you saw people being killed, including the famous Herbert Peterson, I think that's what his name was.
Malimba, just a moment there.
Yeah.
That kid's name was Hector Peterson.
Hector Peterson.
Hector Peterson, 13-year-old schoolboy.
13-year-old schoolboy, yeah.
Yeah, who was shot.
Thank you for clarifying that. So, there's actually a monument in South Africa at one of the museums that is right next to the place where he got shot. Very sad occurrence that happened during a march in South Africa many, many years ago. And so it's just very sad because every time you would try and speak up, you now had your life being threatened. Every time you would protest, you have your life being threatened. So after these occurrences happened, there was a tribal advisory council that was set up, and there were tribal advisory courts that were also set up within major cities, such as the mining cities, as well as Lusaka and Kabwe. And then in the 1940s, you had the European miners having a strike, and they wanted more wages. And not only did they want more wages, they wanted more wages than the Black mine workers. After these protests, the Europeans got what they wanted in 1943. And I think after the killings that happened, it reached a point where it's like, you know what, let everyone just have equal pay, because the protests just weren't going to stop. I think this would be a good segue into the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, which was introduced in the 1950s. And this was where you see a huge conflict of interest, because you have Northern Rhodesia that's full of minerals, but then the rules there and the racial segregation there was much more than Southern Rhodesia and Nyasaland. Nyasaland, which was the former name of Malawi. So you have a conflict of interests here where it's like, okay, do we serve the interests of our people, our local people, or do we serve the interests of ourselves? Because we know that if we have the same governance system as Northern Rhodesia and we are governed collectively, then we might end up having to change some of our laws that will undermine indigenous African habitants. And this interest was in Northern Rhodesia by the Europeans was further increased because of the Second World War, because the copper that was being extracted was being used for the war, the Second World War. And so that more or less motivated the Federation. And when I tell you that this is something that the people of Rhodesia and Nyasaland collectively did not want, they did show it in many ways. And in the 1940s, before this federation actually became official, you had a rise of welfare societies and the Mine Workers Union. And the Federation of Welfare Societies was formed. And in the 1940s, it became a political force. and it was led by someone called Godwin Mbikusita Lewanyika. But in 1951, Godwin Mbikusita Lewanyika was removed because he more or less lacked ambition and he wasn't radical enough to serve the interests of the people. And that's how Harry Nkumbula took charge of this Federation of Welfare Societies, and it was renamed Northern Rhodesian African National Congress. And under Harry Nkumbula, this political force grew a lot because of their extremely radical policies. And the second hand to Harry Nkumbula was the Secretary General known as Kenneth Kaunda, as many of you know him as KK. At this point, the aim of the Northern Rhodesian African National Congress was less about just having better conditions for their people. They wanted full independence. And Kaunda was very pivotal to this because he used to organize the boycotts and the sit-ins, protests that used to happen within the country. In 1955, Kenneth Kaunda and Harry Nkumbula are imprisoned for possessing African literature. And I'm going to pause here because we has gaps, that certain things are missing, and we start to wonder why this is the case. But then I start to think that Kaunda and Harry Nkumbula actually started to access these written materials that would actually document the history that we have as indigenous Zambians. And, it's very sad that it's at this point where they are imprisoned. And they are released. And as soon as they are released, it's like you now have Kaunda, who was for him, it was more like he gained more energy and resilience as he was in prison. And he felt like he started to have more ambition than the people he was working for the Rhodesian National Congress. And it was at this point where he actually started to question the person who he was jailed with, Harry Nkumbula. He felt like Harry Nkumbula's leadership had a lack of ambition, especially because there was this concerning issue where you have Black people that are not voting. So Kaunda decides to break away in the year 1958 and form something called the Zambian African National Congress, which was a new political party. It was at this point when we actually started to see a change in the way the country was being governed. And the Europeans actually started to consider the African population having a say, but they wanted to limit that as well. So they decided that there should be a Northern Rhodesian Legislative Council that included 22 Europeans and 8 African. And for Kaunda and his radical movement, that was not enough. He did not want to settle for that. So Kaunda and his party boycotted this council and termed it as racially biased and continued to fight against the struggle and fight for freedom from the Federation as well as freedom from colonial rule. In 1959, a state of emergency is called, and Kaunda and Harry Nkumbula are detained, and Zambian African National Congress is banned. At this point, you see something very interesting happen. Actually, I would like to correct myself. Kaunda was detained. Nkumbula wasn't detained. But it was at this point where Kaunda's efforts started to actually worry the British rulers.
Is this the same time when the Chachacha protests began, where you had the crying of that freedom call, Kwacha Ngwe. Is that the same time?
This was in 1961, actually. So, but these are some of the things that happened that actually pushed the indigenous Zambians to actually, or as they were called then, indigenous African people of Northern Rhodesia, to actually push for, further demonstration of their discontentment about the colonial rule. And you saw something interesting happen, because you had Harry Nkumbula and the ANC, who were not as radical. They thought they were as radical, but they weren't. And for them, it's like, okay, let's take these seats that are available within this legislative council. So they won a few seats in the legislative council. But even with that, some members of Harry Nkumbula's ANC left his party because they were uncomfortable with just how much executive power he had and his manner of decision-making skills. And they went and joined the Zambian African National Congress members and formed what is called the United National Independence Party in 1959. In 1960, Kenneth Kaunda is finally released from prison, and he's made leader of the United National Independence Party, known as UNIP. And at this time, it started to become more of a when than if situation as to independence of these three nations occurring. In 1960, the British cabinet decided that there should be a 5-year plan of how they would shift towards more of an African majority legislative council, rather than just being largely dominated by the Europeans. At the end of these 5 years, these nations were going to be given a chance to decide whether they want to stay within the federation or not. What we saw then was more of a push for an African majority council before that, for the real radicals within the country. So then you had the colonial office now decide that rather than having an African majority legislative council, they would have something they termed as balanced, with 15 purely African voted members of this council, 15 European, 14 that are jointly voted for, and 1 Asian. But then the condition was that for the 14 jointly voted for members, the ones voted by the Europeans and the Africans, each of them had to receive at least 10% of the African vote and 10% of the European vote. So what ends up happening is that there is an election in 1962 where this form of having a legislative council is implemented, and United National Independence Party wins 60%, European Federal Party win 17%, and the ANC win 23% of these seats. Only 37 of the 45 seats were filled. And this is because these jointly elected members, these 14, most of them failed to get 10%, either 10% African or 10% European vote. But this just shows how the voting pattern was, because it means that the voting was solely based on race rather than it being on the grounds of actual policy and actual leadership. So you see a huge racial divide. And I think this was one of the significant effects that the era of being colonized had. So I'm sure you guys are wondering when I'm going to bring these guys into the conversation. Don't worry, I'm going to bring them in. I hope you've been following. Try your best to follow me. I know this is a lot of information, but it's all important leading up to where we're getting to. So then, after the 1962 election, UNIP and ANC agreed to have a coalition government where Kaunda is made the prime minister. In 1963, the federation is finally dissolved. elections are held in 1964 and a brand new system, and UNIP wins 55 of the 75 seats, and they become the majority in parliament, and they have enough seats to actually administrate the country. And this is when Zambia was said to have attained full independence. And Kenneth Kaunda was then no longer prime minister, but now president. Is there anything you guys want to contribute on before we move to the next section?
I just wanted to pose like a short question for like discussion. Is that like, especially like in modern times, right? When we use the term radical, I guess in the context of South African politics is like usually associated with guys like the EFF and like kind of like the policies that, they try to enact. But it's interesting in that, during like the whole liberation struggle, it was the radical guys that were the ones who I guess everyone was rooting for. So it's interesting to see that on the political scene, radicalism actually does serve a certain like type of purpose. And it's like, if we're trying to then extrapolate what is going on today, what type of person would Kaunda be in our modern times, right? Would he be like the HH who's, like economy, who we think is more rational, critical, or would he, in this case, be like a more radical person who's going to push for, certain reforms, maybe someone like Sata?
Yeah, that would actually be interesting to see. But then you actually see that with time, we become more the passive-aggressive community because we feel like we are more united than we were before. We feel more heard than before. And I guess that's what has made our society to develop in this way. But then it's just very interesting to see how being radical is now shunned upon, because I feel like to some extent, in some situations, it might be necessary to be radical. Kabanga, would you agree?
Yeah, 100%. Another thing is also the leaders of the day reflect the ideals of society. So at that time, when you think about what was happening in Africa, there was that winds of change. Everyone was feeling like we're African. So even in the people that we supported as leaders, those sentiments also showed. So today, things are slightly different, and the sentiments that people have today are not the same as then. So we can't necessarily say he would be more like this person or that person, but maybe more of a reflection of what we want as people today. So I actually don't know what kind of leader he would be today.
Yeah, I guess we can, leave that as a discussion point for the people who are listening. And you can always reach out on our social media platforms and, respond. And we're definitely going to put this as a poll on Spotify as well. So if you want to give your responses there. So yeah, thank you so much for that, guys. So now we are going to talk about certain things that occurred post-independence under the United National Independence Party. So for this segment, I'm actually going to bring Vincent more into this conversation so that he can tell us more about what happens during this time. And over to you, Vincent.
Thank you so much, Malimba. All right. So going into like the new era, which I guess is now UNIP. So from 1964 to 1991. Yeah, within 1964, like the atmosphere is nothing short of ecstatic. Everyone's hopeful. There's a lot of positive energy, and some authors like mark it in that there were a lot of zealous individuals within like government at the time. So everyone was striving to show what a government or a country ruled by the people was capable of. So within our form of self-governance. And just like a note, like going through the period, I'm going to take like a kind of themed approach where I'll just focus on like certain key points and then draw on like the historical timeline every now and again. So getting into it. So like, what were the main benefits that, the government was trying to push for during this new era? And one of the things was the government invested heavily within education, so much so that the literacy rate within Zambia went from 1% to about 16% over the next 2 decades, which is at about 1990. And funny enough, UNZA was actually opened within the next 2 years. So in 1966, UNZA was built, and it was not only for Zambians, but both Zambians and surrounding foreign nationals within African countries. And several like leaders that went to lead or were part of like the movements for like liberation within surrounding countries were actually educated in Zambia, e.g. Emerson Mnangagwa. Whether or not that's a good or bad thing, we can also create another poll for that. But we do see that like within like education was a really important aspect for like the new government. And for most people, even today, when you look at other schools like Hillcrest, Mary Queen, and the like, you kind of like can trace back like semblances of that. And even talking to teachers, like there were a lot of positive gains from those initiatives. And another thing, and on top of just investing in schools and education, the government invested in hospitals, road and power stations. So just other types of infrastructure that were aimed at improving the country beyond just a means for extraction of copper. Because before, during the pre-colonial era, most infrastructure was designed such that it made it easy for copper to be mined from the copper belt and extracted and then transported to where it needed to go. And so this left other regions, mostly regions outside the line of rail, marginalized and underdeveloped. So one of the key strives of the current new government was to kind of provide more like a sense of equality and equal development within the country. And like speaking to that, like the ethos at the time, or more so like the philosophy, I feel it's very important to then touch on Zambian humanism, which was coined as the national philosophy in 1967 and was a fusion of both traditional cultural beliefs from our local indigenous cultures and also Christianity. It's actually interesting to see that within our national philosophy, before Chiluba actually declared that Zambia is a Christian nation, like Christian elements are already ingrained within our philosophy. And in my research, I found this quote by de Klerk, who was like the last president of South Africa during the apartheid era, where when he met with Kaunda in the 1970s, he actually said that Kaunda was an earnest Christian who has thought about the position of Southern Africa. So it's just an interesting theme to see that a lot of our leaders have like had that Christian element or aligning themselves with Christian values as a big aspect of their brand or persona. All right. And then just moving on to like what were the primary beliefs of Zambian humanism? And this was basically of, love your neighbor as you love yourselves. And just reading this verbatim, if we love our neighbors as we love ourselves, we will not exploit them, but work together with them for common good. So within like the whole ethos, like the whole aspect of human dignity was a primary thing that Kaunda and people within his government actually emphasized. And I feel that was one of the key driving points behind also their economic approach with regards to economic policies in prioritizing that each and everyone is afforded basic means in order to live.
On that point, I just wanted to say, I see that that's an approach that a lot of Africans, even today when you have conversations with them about racial justice or anything to do with that, that's their first response. But then the thing is, the issue with that is that you wanting to show love to your neighbor to that level in every situation gives an expectation. It means that you're giving your neighbor an expectation that they are going to treat you the same. And, as we go on in this conversation, we'll kind of realize that that is not always the case. That if you show love to your neighbor will show love to you. That, I think, is the biggest failing point of this way of doing things. So, yeah, that's just the point I wanted to make.
Thank you, Malimba, for that. But also, an interesting, I guess, at this point, Kaunda was an idealist. But I guess in the whole primary belief, the expectation is on, I guess, us or the Zambian people to take the moral higher ground. Because within the philosophy, there is no notion of a tit for tat relationship, but more so that one must respect the dignity of the other person because they're a human being, as opposed to looking to gain, which as you said, in cases of trade or when you're trying to plan economic policy, how your partner is going to relate with you is actually really important. And on top of that, one of the key things that Kaunda did off the back of Zambian humanism was also to coin one Zambia, one nation in order to unify the entire country towards a common goal and a common good, and also to circumvent issues such as tribalism and enable everyone to see themselves as one people. And this in itself also aided the whole philosophy behind now the push for greater liberation for other African countries. And some scholars view this as strongly influenced by Nkrumah's belief that Ghana will never be free until every other African country is free. And then everything is going there's positive energy, things are going well within the early, for most of the decade from 1964. And then we jump towards the end of the 1960s, and we start to now slowly see the cracks. And I guess this may be the shortcoming of having a radical idealist view. And so we see that Kaunda becomes increasingly intolerant of the opposition towards the 1968 elections, and he wins the elections, but slowly becomes increasingly intolerant towards the opposition. And also at the time, we see Simon Kapwepwe, who leaves UNIP to form his own party, or a rival party called the United Progressive Party. And as a result, after Kaunda wins, he then appoints Mainza Chona to then basically change the constitution such that Zambia then becomes a one-party state. And he's then given greater control over things and reduces any competition or disagreements towards his policies and intentions. And some scholars have viewed this as a way for him to have consolidated power, in that he wanted to focus on, one, his freedom campaign to liberate the surrounding Southern African countries, and at the same time, his socialist development policies within the country. And one thing that I found interesting is that Nyerere, Julius Nyerere, who was the president of our neighboring country, Tanzania, in 1962, when he provides like the Preventative Detention Act in 1962, he slowly begins to take a similar approach of trying to quiet like the voice of the opposition and like consolidate power around him. And like Kaunda, he has a similar philosophy for African socialism where like they're aiming to provide equality and raise the dignity of like general people, and also at the same time liberate the surrounding countries. And just trying to draw parallels, it wouldn't be far-fetched in that Kaunda may have been inspired by what his counterpart was able to do, and this may have given him the leeway to actually try this approach. And it's also interesting to see that from the Preventative Detention Act, where in Tanzania you could be jailed without trial, we also see during this one-party state the act in which people can be jailed for defamation against the president. And we see that at multiple times in different periods, in one case, like in Mwanawasa's case, and also more recently in the case of PF, where we see Lungu jailing HH for treason, trying to use that act. It comes up time and time again as a way of silencing the voice of the opposition. So I found that was a very interesting thing to note, and may actually also raise the question of, how accountable are the politics going in surrounding African countries and what their influence is in our own like local context. And so we're now within the 1970s and things slowly begin to crack. Well, within a one-party state type of rule, Kaunda is basically our authoritarian leader, and anyone who speaks against the president in certain cases can either be jailed or can end up disappearing. At the time, someone please correct me if I'm wrong, there was the whole thing of, shishushus, where if you were just heard like speaking out against Kaunda, you could just silently be taken away without anyone knowing about you.
Yeah, that's actually correct. People used to disappear.
That's crazy.
So, yeah, like the phenomenon of the shushushu is real. And to some extent, like we actually see that that's how the office of the president is seen these days. You hear a lot of rumors. I don't know how true they are. In a conversation with people from OP are like special agents that are not in uniform, and there are people who you would least suspect. So they would be tapping into hearing conversations that you're having about politics, and you don't actually realize that you're giving someone information that they could possibly use against you.
No, thank you for that. Which it's honestly, in today's age where we have like a bit more liberty, it's crazy to think that you could just at one point completely disappear for, criticizing someone. All right. So getting back to the 1970s. So within the 1970s, on top, I've already said it, on top of like the one-party state, we now slowly begin to see decreasing copper prices. And I think one thing I should have noted importantly is that a lot of like the social development programs and like infrastructure that was built within the early 1960s was actually funded off the back of revenues from like the mining industries. So like the health of the Zambian economy was highly tied to, or closely tied to, copper prices. So much so that when plotting GDP per capita against copper prices, like there was a closely matched trend. So when copper went up, life and GDP per capita went up, and then when it went down, it went down. And another important thing to note is actually around this era, the nationalization of the mining and also retail sectors in 1968 and 1969. So we now also see that government is now taking over these key resource industries and like furthering their whole campaign to use like the funding from these key sectors to push for social programs. But in doing this, they ended up overemploying within these industries, and also the state-owned parastatals were also inefficiently mismanaged, because most people who are put within important positions were Kaunda loyalists, as he became more and more paranoid with controlling power during this period in time. And so towards the end of the 1970s, on top of the collapse in copper prices, we also see that Kaunda tries to get help from like the IMF within the early 1980s in order to then reform the economy and obtain debt relief. But then we see that this didn't really necessarily work, because during like the middle of the period, there was an additional oil shock, which increased commodity prices, which added additional strain on top of like the mismanagement and the low copper prices. So the economy was in a lot of financial strain.
On that point, at this time also, because we're so involved in the liberation struggles in Southern Africa, and there were sanctions which had been placed on then Southern Rhodesia, as well as apartheid South Africa. So these two nations also put counter sanctions against Zambia. And at that time, our trade and economy was very heavily invested in those corridors for our copper to actually leave the country. So that's also another thing which contributed to our economic decline in that period.
Thank you so much, Barnes. So then moving on from that point, basically from the 1980s moving forward, things really didn't get any better. Towards the end of the 1980s, we then see that towards the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, or basically around the period of 1990, people are now fed up with Kaunda, and like his popularity amongst the people has completely faded. And then we then begin to see the inklings of the pro-democracy movement within 1990, which then begins to push for multi-party politics. And also at the same time, there are 3 days of protesting within the capital, which was at the time Lusaka. And in October 1990, opposition parties are then allowed to contest within elections, and we move from a one-party system to a multi-party system. And shortly after the announcement within October, there was a coup attempt on Kaunda, on which, as it's described, an overzealous officer went on to ZNBC to announce that they had taken over the country, but this was thwarted shortly 3 to 4 hours afterwards. And one thing that Kaunda, by other scholars, is noted or respected for doing, in that his term would have ended in 1993 when he was re-elected in 1998. But looking at the times and seeing that people wanted him out of power, he chose to hold elections in October 1991, in which he lost to Chiluba, who won through a landslide victory. That generally marks... But before I close, one thing which was like a theme that has been pointed towards through most of the conversation is that Kaunda supported other surrounding African countries to gain their independence. And several people like Kabanga had noted that it affected our trade, and others have noted that what benefits did this actually bring, supporting other African countries. And so this actually bolstered Zambia's international image, in that a lot of countries hold Zambia in a positive light, and also Kaunda so. And at the same time, in certain contexts, this actually helped facilitate and increase cross-border trade amongst regional countries within Southern and East Africa, or basically with Zambia's surrounding neighbors. So even though the benefits could be contested of Kaunda's campaign for independence, for the surrounding African countries, there were some merits to his efforts. But whether or not there were overall gains for the Zambian people is one thing that can be discussed and is open to be contested. And on that note, I will close the UNIP era and within the MMD era, handing over to Kabanga. He'll go into more detail, especially around the issues towards the end of the one-party state moving into multi-party democracy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vincent. But you're not going anywhere just yet. I think one thing that I would like us to just think about really is that for people who say that there wouldn't have been any, people who believe that Kaunda shouldn't have done this, he shouldn't have spent all this time trying to liberate all these African countries. The clear need for these efforts is seen in the fact that it took up to 1980 for Southern Rhodesia to become independent. And it took South Africa another 14 years after that to achieve independence and for apartheid to come to an end. I guess those were the issues with that. Yeah, I feel like that's all I wanted to just bring up. Kabanga, do you have anything to say before we move on? Or conclude, rather?
I think I'll tie in the elements of what Vincent was saying into what I have to say about the MMD era.
Okay, great. So this has been a great conversation, but unfortunately we have to cut this conversation here and continue the conversation the next time we reconvene for the next episode. And so I'll just like to thank my guests, Kabanga and Vincent, for having this conversation with me. But when we come back next week, we are going to continue this conversation, and we're going to start from more or less where we actually start to experience multi-party democracy as a country, go all the way until October 2022. So it's going to be a very interesting conversation. And I think you will start to understand some of the things that have helped us get to where we are at. So, this has been an amazing conversation. And thank you to all our collaborators. Shout out to Robert. Shout out to each and every collaborator we've had throughout Zambia History Month. We still have 2 weeks after this. So, if I were you guys, I would just sit back and, be excited and be expectant for more conversations. So with that being said, it's bye for now. Thank you.